thanks for that nice introduction. And I'd also like to thank Clark and Ravi and Drew, Marzo Chair, for inviting me here and making it possible for me to be here. I'm very excited. I just texted one of my friends. I haven't walked down College Avenue in about 25 years, and so it felt nice to be back. So I'd like to start today by just giving you some sense of the ground I'm going to cover today. We look by socioeconomic status. And I think it's interesting that we have low SES and non-low SES. You know, we don't necessarily say high SES. You know, that says something about us. But again, we see this tremendous achievement gap. And I'm going to come back to this in a moment. And I'll preface this by saying if I learn nothing from my advisor, it's strategic troublemaking. So this next slide usually gets me in trouble a little bit. Somebody usually wants to talk to me about it afterwards. And so I want us to think about what our goal would be. You know, for that chart, what do we want the goal for that chart to be? If we lived in a fair society, you know, would race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status have a correlation with academic achievement? I don't think so. I think there wouldn't be a correlation. If we lived, you know, and I'm going to out myself as a techie nerd, I think of that Star Trek universe, right? Like, what would achievement levels look like on the Enterprise under Picard, right? You know, if you're looking at the kids on that ship, I kind of think it would look like this, where the only differences were statistical noise. You know, and I think this is a worthy goal. But right now we don't have this, right? We have this. So clearly, race is, at least in terms of these NAEP scores here, race is a factor in the explanation somehow. There is a correlation. And as science teacher educators, I think, you know, my field and even teacher education more widely, we have an obligation to address this issue. And again, I want to ask that same question I asked before. How much of this has to do with the way that science is actually taught? And I need to take a detour here, a demographic detour. So if you'll oblige me on this. Again, somebody usually wants to talk to me about this afterwards, but I analyzed these data myself. This is from the New Jersey Department of Ed, and this is the demographic profile of New Jersey students. So 56% white, and this is from census and SAS data. 56% white, 16% African American. Slightly more diverse than other states in the country, but by no means the most diverse. But then when we look at the demographic profile of science teachers, we see something very interesting. That you know, the majority of science teachers are white. And you know, we can ask the question: does this matter? You know, should it matter? You know, and Carter Woodson back in 1933 said, no, it shouldn't matter at all. You know, there is no particular body of facts that, you know, Negro teachers can impart to children of their own race that may not be just as easily presented by persons of another race. And he went on to say, but, you know, race hatred and all those other factors make that often impossible. But here's the thing for me, is that it might matter in some very interesting ways, in ways that we can address. You know, we can do all the recruiting that we want. And right now I'm involved in a couple different projects at Montclair to beef up the number of science teachers in New Jersey. But we might not be able to impact that 90% number very much, but we can ameliorate its effects if it is having an impact on student achievement. So I want to anticipate some of the arguments that might arise right from the beginning about connecting, you know, race, you know, and learning science. And the first one that may come up, and in the grad school of education, I'm sure many of you have dealt with the issue of color blindness before, right? Where, you know, people say people are individuals, race doesn't matter. You know, we can say race shouldn't matter, but when we look at those achievement charts, clearly there is something going on there. Then I'll hear the argument that, you know, science and race don't have any connection. Maybe science biographies, right? We'll talk about Elijah McCoy. We'll try to incorporate some multicultural content into science teaching. But then when you press harder, people will say, you know, there's no such thing as a multicultural atom. You know, Newton's laws apply from multiple perspectives below the speed of light. It doesn't matter who's looking at them, right? Although it does. But James Banks, one of the founders of the field of multicultural education, said that a multicultural atom is an atom that's taught in a way that every kid can understand. And another argument that I'll hear is like, well, you know, if there are these teacher effects, if that 90% of white teachers is impacting the differential achievement of students identified as non-white, that would imply rampant racism, you know, and it doesn't seem plausible to people that that's the case. Certainly there's, you know, sort of systemic racism issues that seem more plausible, but the idea that there's 90% of white teachers is intentionally discriminating against non-white students doesn't seem plausible to people. And I would argue that there is some deeper connection there. Maybe racism isn't the right word, but there is something there. And then we have the probabilistic argument. The argument that there are plenty of students of color who reach high levels of achievement. So race can't be a limiting factor. And to me, this argument speaks to a failure of probabilistic thinking. If we know that a particular high school has only 50% graduation rate for its African American students, and we look at a classroom of our students, probabilistically that means that 50% of the students in that class, provided equally distributed, are going to run into problems with graduation. It's hard for people to think like that, but I would argue it's not necessarily a limiting factor. That these effects aren't necessarily direct and correlate one-to-one. Okay. So let me come back off my detour, and I want to come back to this question of how do these two problems, being able to learn science for understanding and being able to teach all students equitably, how do they connect? And here's the sort of theory part, and this is where we get into the nature of what might charitably be called misconceptions. And I want to start right from the beginning, because I know Clark's in the room. that I like the Smith and DeSessa and Rochelle definition of misconceptions, that they're faulty extensions of productive prior knowledge. Right? To the person who holds it, it's not a misconception, it's a conception, because whatever that idea is adequately explains the world to them. And so we can look at Sunita Williams eating a waffle up in space, and some students may have the misconception that there's no gravity in outer space, right? So there's a misconception. Because there's plenty of gravity in outer space. But I started to notice parallels between those kind of misconceptions, those science misconceptions, and what we could call teacher misconceptions. So one might be students learn best from clear explanations. We all know that teacher who prepared very carefully and had a very thoughtful explanation, sent it to the kids, gave the test the next day, and they bombed. And so maybe that's not the way that students learn best. So I started seeing similarities in sort of the way that these ideas were held in the minds of students and teachers alike. And it made sense to me as a grad student thinking about these things, that learning science and learning to teach operated on those same general principles of learning. And to me, I still go back to that how people learn framework as a really useful way of thinking about both teaching content and about teaching teachers. Okay, so I hope this is okay. Here we go. So I like the theory of conceptual change. To me, it was a very useful theory because I used it as a science teacher. I used ideas about teaching for conceptual change in my own teaching as a physics teacher. But as I started looking into it, I saw that there were really two traditions of conceptual change. And really that's what the Teachers College article was about sketching out the boundaries of these two different traditions of talking about conceptual change. Because I felt that oftentimes the two groups were talking past one another. So both traditions have their origins in Piagetian thinking and Thomas Kuhn. But then we have sort of the science education tradition. There's a classic paper by Posner, Strike, Houston, and Vertov, which is really sort of the foundation. I think it's one of the most cited papers in science education history. And then there's what I term the educational psychology tradition, where in the science education tradition, the purpose of looking at conceptual change was to figure out how to teach better. And in the ed psych tradition, the purpose of looking at conceptual change was thinking about the mechanisms of cognition. And of course, there are people, and some of them in this room, who are able to straddle both worlds very well. But that isn't always the case. And so, drawing upon different aspects of these two traditions, I wanted to just explain the theoretical model that I used for looking at teacher thinking and particularly teacher thinking about race and how it changed over time. So the basic idea of conceptual change from the perspective I'm using is you have, ideas have intelligibility, plausibility, and fruitfulness, and the more of those things that it has, the higher status it has in the mind of the person who holds it. So if I want to, the classic example is, which is heavier, a book or a sheet of paper, right? Okay, the book must be heavier. Why? Because it weighs more, right? But if I crumple up this paper and I drop them together, okay, maybe the new idea is that the mass of the paper doesn't matter so much. So I take that existing concept and I introduce a new concept, and with a little teaching and a little bit of thinking, now the new concept becomes more plausible, and now I think that's the idea that has the higher status in my mind, and that's the one that I hold. And again, I color-coded these, so the science education tradition of conceptual change is more concerned with these blue rectangles up here, and psych tradition is more concerned with the workings of this fulcrum. The other piece of the theoretical framework that I use is this idea of a conceptual ecology. And it goes back to Toulmin, who actually called it an intellectual ecology. And once the environmental movement was through with it, it became a conceptual ecology. But this idea that all the ideas that we hold in our head are linked in some way. And when we talk about teaching, your conceptions about teaching are linked to all sorts of things. Your conceptions about learning, about science, rationale for instruction, your personal beliefs, characteristics of the learner, and of course all these things are connected to each other as well. So what I wanted to do in my work was to isolate a few pieces of these. So the pieces that I looked at were conceptions about race, ethnicity, and culture, conceptions about teaching, and this wonderful phrase from Lynn Payne, conceptions about the pedagogical implications of student diversity. What do these factors imply for one's teaching? Okay, and so let me just take one moment. I'm going to focus on race here, just in terms of this talk. And it's important to note, obviously there is no necessarily biological concept of race. Race does not exist at a biological level, but it is definitely a social construct. And so we can talk about race in terms of stereotypes. We can talk about it in terms of racism, social relations, historical context, property rights in particular. Race has a very clear history in this country as being constructed as part of property rights. Because if you were one race, you were property. Racial ideologies, and actually as a legal construct. We can think about Brown versus Board of Ed, busing, but we can also go back to the early parts of the 20th century where Lemon Grove case where a Mexican family sued to be counted as white and not black. So it's actually it's part of our social fabric as a legal construct as well. So we have to acknowledge this. But for me, it was equally as interesting to start thinking about race as a conceptual scheme. And I use that phrase very intentionally, drawn from the work of James Conant, who was a mentor to Thomas Kuhn, and thought about these interlocking schemes. And he would use an example of air pressure. If we're going to understand air pressure, we have to have an idea of air. We have to have an idea of force. And he would link all these ideas into a conceptual scheme, which we might now call an explanatory framework, or even a model. I actually like thinking about this as a model in our current next generation science standards framework of what a model means. So race as a way of explaining something. So we can talk about race the way that individuals use it as a phenomenon for creating predictive models. A good model explains data and it predicts data, right? It predicts future data. And so I think that, and this is sort of the new part where I'm going with my my work right now, is that this question of what does race explain? Certainly, there's a long history of looking at race in terms of identity formation. Beverly Tatum's wonderfully titled book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, addresses this very question. And her answer to that is that the way that people think about race is influenced by the way they're treated and seen by others. We also have this sense of culture as a perceptual filter that, and again, Thomas Kuhn called it paradigm, but we can think of culture as this way of interpreting fast-moving data that enters our brains and helps us to sort it into conceptual categories very quickly, and race actually serves that function. My favorite new book, if you read one book this year, Thinking Fast and Slow by Dan Kahneman, is absolutely, it's changed the way that it was the key that unlocked a couple of mysteries for me. This one of the attribute substitution heuristic, substituting one category that's very hard to think about with another that's very easy to think about. and using that for decision making in our day-to-day processes. To me, is a wonderful way of thinking about it. Okay, so this there's all that, but really at the base level, I want to ask, what does this concept of race explain? To any given individual, what does this concept of race explain? And more interestingly, how does that change as somebody learns to teach? So for this study, I actually, okay, so this is a methodological note. I actually had 22 people in this study. I was able to gather full data on about 14 of them, where I went in, did about 6 observations of each person in their student teaching site. I interviewed them at 3 times at 6-month intervals. It was a lot of work, but at the end of the day, you know, and my dissertation ended up being about 500 pages, and I was able to slim it down to this. So have hope. Okay. So I did too much, but I did a lot, and I was able to pick cases that were really cases we could learn from, which, you know, is Robert Stake's advice in any case study approach, is pick cases that, you know, you can learn from, that are useful to you. So I tried to design this in a way where I had an equal male-female balance, an equal balance of roughly biology, chemistry, and physics. I had a range of ages, but like the 90% figure I showed you for New Jersey, and this takes place in a unnamed Midwestern state. The demographic profile I had to draw from in terms of science teacher pre-service students was largely white. So I'm going to talk about 2, and I'm just in the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about the physics part, but in the question and answer, I'm happy to talk about the other parts as well. So let me give you a little background on Tyler. And again, the question is, how do his conceptions about race, teaching, and those pedagogical implications of student diversity, how do those change over the course of a teacher education program? And I should say up front that my rationale for doing this project, one of them anyway, is that I was frustrated with all these interventions, all these different things that were, you know, as a teacher even, all these different things people tried to intervene to improve my practice, but they didn't really have a baseline. You know, it's like trying to improve instruction but not doing a pre-assessment. Right? If you don't know where people are. And I started to feel that even somebody researching this stuff, I didn't have a good handle on how people's minds change normally during teacher education without any extra intervention. So I wanted to just see, you know, so this was not an intervention study. This was more of a, we can call it maybe an ethnography, there's a little bit of anthropology in here. But really I wanted to just take a map out this field of teacher change. Okay, so Tyler was getting a certification in biology and physics. He was doing his student teaching in a very diverse high school. He saw teaching as the clear communication of information. So today, lectures work, this is Eleanor Duckworth, I'm channeling her. Lectures work when the audience already knows 90% of the material. I'm assuming that a lot of this isn't new for you, what I'm lecturing about today, but I'm putting it together in a different way. He didn't see teaching that way. He saw teaching as the controlled delivery of information. And he was very ambivalent about the value of his teacher education coursework. You know, he thought that teacher certification was just sort of this bureaucratic necessity. And as we got to talk a little more when we talked about race, he actually brought up an incident where he was upbraided by an instructor over his interpretation of Delpit's silence dialogue, which again is one of those classic pieces. And he was a student just trying to make sense of it, and he was shut down by someone in the teacher education program and said, you know, that's the wrong way. You need to believe this, and he took that with him. And so his belief about learning to teach was it just comes from experience. You know, you get thrown in and you do it, and that's how you learn to teach. I don't agree with that, but I think if it's sink or swim, you either sink or you maybe doggy paddle. And a couple people really learn how to swim, but most people just get to doggy paddle. So when I asked him that question about the Van de Graaff gender, and again, this was like an hour-and-a-half interview. I'm just taking a representative slice. When I asked him in September, the question scared him terribly. He said, I would be willing to sacrifice the science not to address it. You know, to him, he thought, especially from his incident in teacher education, race was this fearful subject with unpredictable power. He didn't know what the consequences of talking about race would be. So he said, I would just say it doesn't have any effect and move on, right? He didn't want to even get into talking about electrostatics and forces on hair. He just said, no, I don't want to talk about it at all. By May, however, he had gotten to know his students a little better, and he actually said, well, this might be an opportunity for inquiry. We might be able to, somehow in the class come up, and investigate this question. But again, when I pressed him and said, well, how would you do that? Would you? He was very tentative. He said, I could only do it if I felt safe in that room. And so he still had that bit of a threat fear to it. And he actually talked about, when it would work, when it wouldn't work. But he had a better understanding of inquiry, to be sure, that he hadn't been willing to go in September. So what race explained for Tyler in the beginning? He saw race. What race did for him is it explained the causes of discrimination, conflict, and student grouping. So when he saw groups, students, when he saw the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, to him, race was the reason why they were all sitting together. Race was a reason for discrimination. It was also a source for conflict. And that was, I have to say that was true across many of the teachers in the study. Many people thought about race in terms of conflict. Again, these are mostly white teachers. Other than that, race didn't really explain anything to him, and he wanted to be colorblind. He wanted to say it had nothing to do. And so again, his discomfort arose from its connection to conflict and unpredictability. By May, something very interesting happened, is that he was very into grading. His whole thing was being able to produce an accurate grade. So this actually led him down for me as a teacher educator, a very fruitful path of assessment. Right? He really wanted to assess his students accurately. And what he noticed was that in his class, his African American students were very, very good at analogic thinking, at coming up with analogies for things. Much better than his white students were. And this actually created discomfort for him because race wasn't supposed to explain anything. And from an academic standpoint, I could talk about Shirley Brythese's work and patterns of communication and different ways of different epistemologies, right? But he was just looking at they're coming up with interesting analogies, and my white kids aren't coming up with any. And this remained a puzzle for him. I mean, we talked about it at coffee shops in August, but interestingly, race became less important to him in explaining student interactions. His school actually had a very proactive, we could call it a tolerance movement, where they were working very closely on making sure that students got along. And so he started to see, oh, race doesn't really matter. And meanwhile, he completely ignored the fact that the white kids at that school were graduating at 90% grades, and the African American students were graduating, and Latino students were graduating at 45, 50%. He didn't see that part. Okay, so that's Tyler. Jethro and okay, another methodology thing. If you let your participants pick their own pseudonyms, you have to live with it. It's an ethical commitment to the research. Okay, and he actually, Tull was the last name. I just went with first name, but he actually wanted to be Jethro Tull. Yeah. So he was a second career teacher. He was born in the city where I did the research. He moved away to the South for 30 years to work as an electrical engineer, and then moved back as a second career switch to get into teaching. And hence Jethro. He liked the whole Southern boy thing. He would say that if he were here. He was also student teaching in, I would say, probably the most diverse school in a very segregated city. And he also viewed teaching as the act of conveying subject matter. He had a little bit more, he wanted students to like it. He didn't necessarily see the delivery as the only part. He wanted his students to like his class and like him. But he was very focused on external motivation. And I took this picture in his classroom. I don't know if you can see it, but it's that sign. It says, "Quiet earns rewards." And to me, that encapsulates his classroom management philosophy. It was all about, and these are high school juniors and seniors, right? But it was all about, if you do this, I'll give you that. If you don't do this, then this will be the sanction or the penalty. And he operated like that throughout the whole year, or the whole semester of student teaching. Now, he highly valued his university coursework to the point where he tried to copy exactly the strategies, not just from his teacher ed coursework, but he was taking physics coursework as well, just to bone up on his physics, and he was employing those same strategies that he was in a university calculus-based college physics class, and doing that with his students, and that did not always work. But to me, it was very interesting to see. He saw what his, and this is a message that I've given this talk at other places, that rings very strongly with the disciplinary folks, that what you do with your undergraduates and your graduates, they may copy those exact same things in high school students. So think about very carefully how you are teaching that class, because those same techniques may likely show up in your child's school. Okay, so when I asked Jethro this question, in September, it was just so, it didn't even reach that level of plausibility. It's like, why would a student ask that? Like, what? So, I mean, he was laughing at me and thought that, it was a silly question. And he just said, he said, well, he'd explore why they thought that, but he just thought it was silly. In January, he said, well, he recognized that his teacher education program was emphasizing multicultural education. So he said, okay, I'll do that multicultural thing. We'll take a day off from physics, and we'll go explore people's heritages. He never used the word race or ethnicity. He always used the word heritage, which to me was very interesting in trying to figure out where that sat in his conceptual ecology. But he said, we'll talk about where people are from and what that is. And then in May, he was asked that question by a student. He was asked that very, this totally implausible question. And I didn't plan it with any kids, I swear. After it happened, I thought, oh, I should have planned that with all the kids. But he said, okay, well, let's try it. And he brought students up, and they demonstrated it. But again, he moved the focus. And anybody who's done any work in race talk knows that when somebody's feeling uncomfortable about race talk, they change the topic as fast as they can. I mean, this is my work, so people do this to me all the time, I know. But as soon as you start talking about race, he did that as well. The initial question was about race. He changed it immediately to talking about hair length, and you got the kids off the topic of race as fast as he could. So what did race explain for Jethro? In September, again, it was about the past, and that word heritage was my clue that he thought race was something in the past. It was not something in the present. But it still implied that potential for conflict. And he also saw race as a marker of one's minority status with the social implications. He did not necessarily feel as a teacher he had any role to play in transforming what those social implications might be. Teaching was hard enough, in his words, that trying to change the world on top of that was a bridge too far. And again, he used that term heritage as a proxy for race. By May, again, like Tyler, he saw that race was less indicative of the potential for conflict than he had thought it would be. And he also thought of race as a possible way to make lessons relevant, though he just didn't see how. So it was that idea of knowing what to do but not knowing how to do it. He knew he had to make lessons relevant to his students, and he knew that race was one way to do it. He actually struggled with the generation gap, where it took him a good 8 months to recognize the developmental differences, and I'm not kidding, between middle schoolers and college students. And so appropriateness, some of you who've worked with student teachers know appropriateness can sometimes be an issue. That was hard. So relevance alone was hard, let alone cultural relevance. Okay. So a couple of the takeaway messages. One, that we know conceptions about teaching and learning and student diversity are difficult and slow to change because they're plausible. These are models with explanatory power. And so when we ask, how come a student, we have them read Lisa Delpit's article, how come they're not changing their ideas about race? Because it's slow, because it's hard, because you have to now, everything that concept already explains, you have to now use the new framework to explain it. It was easy making the move from Newtonian to Einstein mechanics comparatively than this. You have to really be able to explain everything with these new ideas. And the other thing was that in teacher education, we often try to place our student teachers in diverse settings, get them out of their comfort zone, whatever that comfort zone may be. But that in and of itself doesn't lead to knowledge gains about race. But again, it does provide some of that raw material for them to think about. But in teacher education, I would make the argument that we need to also create the space for them to do things with that knowledge. And again, this kind of goes back to the how people learn framework. And I'm talking to learning sciences folks. That idea that you need some, something to work with. And so teaching in a diverse setting gives you that something to work with, but without intentional effort, it's not going to happen. Also, to me what was interesting was that the new conceptions that they had interacted with their existing, it was part of that conceptual ecology. But it sometimes, to an outside observer, might appear that they went backwards. So the example is that both Tyler and Jethro realized that race labeling need not imply conflict. So that moved them into this colorblind zone. Now, if we just looked at, are they coming out of a teacher education program colorblind, thinking that race doesn't matter, we might not necessarily see that's perhaps an improvement upon where they were. And this is, the idea of learning progression is really, this is part of that learning progression. And I need visual metaphors. So my metaphor for learning progression is, I used to play in the woods and walk across rocks in a stream. And sometimes to get across, you got to walk back a little bit and go forward. Or the bee trying to get out the window has to go back and then out another spot. So it's not necessarily what we want in terms of a vision of good teaching, but it can still represent progress, which is hard. As a teacher educator, it's difficult to swallow sometimes. So on a larger scale, and again, looking across all of the participants, diversity often had, and I say diversity, meaning large-scale diversity, had little salience for these teachers because attending to student thinking wasn't part of their vision of teaching. And I like to use the metaphor of student ideas are the raw materials of our work. And if you don't know what those student ideas are, and imagine it a lump of clay and a potter trying to build a pot. If you don't know where the lump of clay is or how much you have, you're not going to make a very good pot. And so many teachers didn't even think that it was worthwhile to find out what their students' ideas were. And so this is where I'm going next. To me, the idea of probabilistic thinking, being able to calculate, probabilities of, what are the probabilities that this student in front of me has had this experience or that experience? Because when you're teaching 150 kids a day, you don't always get to know every kid's background and story from day one. So teachers need to be able to think probabilistically. And to me, this is going to be part of the answer for that question of enactment. That question of knowing what to do but not knowing how to do it. I'm excited about this direction of research. Thank you. So I'll pause there for questions. I'm happy to answer questions. I just put a couple things up here, but the framework I use, the instruments I use, methodology, ethics, the actual writing of this. The dissertation took a year, and then it took a year to turn this big dissertation into a 500-page dissertation into a 150-page book, or implications for teacher.
Any question?
The graph that you showed at the beginning says there's sort of a relationship between the race of the teacher and success, but on the other hand, you're saying that it's an if. So I'm wondering, is there any systematic study that says the race of the teacher does impact the success of students by race?
Here's how I would put it: that it is a probabilistic relationship. Right. So there are a number of studies out there that attempt to correlate, and especially this is getting going with the value-added research that's happening now. There are some studies that show correlations between race of the teacher and race of the student. They're weak correlations, but they're there. And so, given this framework, my explanation would be that if you and I share similar backgrounds, that I'm more likely to understand your experiences and some of the ways that you think about the content. Right? I'm also apt to, again, it's not a given, it's a probability. I'm more likely to understand cultural patterns of communication, for example. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
think, I mean, we can posit some reasons, but I was just wondering whether there's systematically study that and partial down impact of other factors that contribute to success, and then after factoring out the impact of interest, aptitude, race, and skill have an impact on success rate.
Yes, there are a number of studies. Like I don't have them off the top of my head, but there are a number of studies that look at, that try to gauge effect sizes for these different attributes. I know Jean Anion, who just passed away, wrote a wonderful book in 2005 called Radical Possibilities, and I know in that book that she went through a lot of that research to talk about, how much does a teacher matter, how much do home factors matter, how much do these other, how much does healthcare matter. So there actually is there's a large body of literature on that subject. But I think it's actually interesting. I don't always align with the value-added philosophies, but I think we have a lot to learn through what's happening in value-added right now, and I think that there's probably there's got to be a handful of studies in the value-added world that look very closely at correlating teacher and student backgrounds with achievement score.
I have a question about, so I like this sort of conception of and the goal that all children in the classroom access and is. I'm wondering how important is it to you, or how important you think it is for cultural responsiveness to also include a critical dimension. So if I'm not mistaken, one of the things that Victoria makes is that is actually one of the pillars, that it's not just that you're sort of cultural responsivism and are able to teach those children effectively, but that there's actually a critical aspect. So how do you feel about that, and where does that feature?
So I'll frame this by talking about my current work a little bit. So I work in the Newark Montclair Urban Teacher Residency Program. We received one of the 26 or so US DOE grants to create a teacher residency. And we have the secondary strand in which I work is all math and science. And so I've been critiquing these from the outside. Now I'm on the inside and have to do something, right? So how do we do this? I think the first thing to recognize is that the reason we even talk about diversity is because when we talk about a particular group, what we're really talking about is the relationship of that group to the dominant group in the society. And so, in the end, it's always about power, right? I mean, it has to be about power, and it has to be about, preparing. So in my work now, preparing teachers to be transformative agents in the society, right? We don't want. I'll just say I don't want to produce teachers in my work who are just going to replicate the status quo and inequalities in society, particularly in terms of power structures. And so how do we actually do that? To me, that's an interesting question, because one of the next things I'm thinking about is, so how do we, I designed a study to look at what's happening now. What might the intervention look like? So part of the intervention is that multicultural awareness, right? That awareness of if someone's coming from a position of privilege, that's acknowledged, and so we have to stay humble, right? So that's a piece of it. So, how do you teach somebody humility? Is a really thorny, almost a moral question, right? Should we teach somebody humility? I like to think that's a good idea. But I think to us, so the way I want to answer your question is, it comes down to that vision of good teaching in a program. And I've come to think as that vision of good teaching as a form of current. And so our student teacher, I'm going to use a physics metaphor, sorry. Our student teachers are like electron drift, right? They're going to bounce around in all random directions, but they're going to drift in that current of the teacher ed program. And if we foreground teaching for social justice, understanding societal inequities, and understanding the pedagogical implications for student teaching in our own work, and sometimes that just means owning the problem, right? Or not ignoring something. That, the definition of privilege is being able to ignore problems. So not ignoring things and owning problems as they come up before you. To me, that's one answer. It doesn't quite satisfy me, but I feel like the right answer is in that direction. The thing that we can't do is like Tyler's teacher with the Delphi article. You know, as much as we want to yell at or sternly discipline students for coming with naive conceptions about, you know, the way the world operates or even what race is, we have to meet them where they are. We have to meet our students where they are, and we have to work with their conceptions and, you know, bring them to a place where, or you know, provide that environment where they're able to reflect on their own ideas. But if we lecture at them about multiculturalism, it's going to be no different than lecturing at them about, you know, Gauss's law. You know, they might know it for the test, but it's not going to become part of them. So that's where the teaching for conceptual change part comes in. And I think, you know, in teacher ed, one of the things that we do is we have these really compressed programs now, right? And it might be that time is a really crucial factor for making space for reflecting. So that's the direction that we're going in our program. It's a shot, but I think I have more of a sense of what not to do than what to do.
Yeah. So, partially to Jimmy's point, my understanding is that the literature, the empirical research is somewhat limited in terms of, you know, particularly strong quantitative research, and it's a relationship. We haven't yet developed that research base. So my question is, as you work with these teachers and study the changes in their beliefs, attitudes, and their pedagogy, are you also looking at the students and how they're responding to this? It seems to be just a great opportunity.
So this is where the methodology gets hard, right? Because so to answer your question, not so much, right? So there have been, so I'll give an example. In Tyler's classroom, there were some student interactions that he had with students that were, it was clear to me what the student was thinking. So yeah, I observed in his classroom. He was setting up for a calorimetry lab the next day, and he was going to be using peanuts. So he was checking with the class to make sure that nobody had a peanut allergy. Okay, good practice, right? And I hope he had a backup plan in case anybody said yes. But a girl in his class, an African American student, raised her hand and she said, "What kind of peanuts?" And he said, "What do you mean, what kind of peanuts? Why does it matter?" And she's like, "Well, you know, is it cashews, or is it almonds, or is it, you know?" And so in her conceptual category of what peanuts were all nuts, right? He interpreted that as sort of a wisecrack, right? Whereas me, you know, I pick up student misconceptions like pebbles on beautiful shiny pebbles on a beach. Like, I love them. I love beautiful misconceptions. There's nothing better than a wonderful misconception. And to me, I just thought that was darling. But he got mad, you know. And so because he wasn't necessarily trying to think about his students' thinking, there was a moment there where it became a classroom management issue when it need not have happened. So that's not really saying anything about student achievement or, you know, how well students are learning. And really, one, you know, a lone researcher, you know, I had my hands full trying to go to 14 classrooms. But I think it's an interesting question, right? So if we have some kind of, let's say we can even put a number on how culturally relevant a teacher is. Like, let's say we can quantify that, which I'm not sure we can, but let's, for the sake of, you know, a thought experiment, let's think we can do that. Could we correlate that to student achievement by race, ethnicity, socioeconomic background? I think that'd be a wonderful experiment. I think that'd be a really, really interesting line of inquiry, and I'd love to do it. By the same token, I have to say, I really, you know, I was Boy Scout. I tried to stay really honest with the IRB stuff. If I was going into a class, I didn't do it unless I had district approval with the IRB, principal approval, cooperating teacher approval. I have an IRB folder this thick from this study. And really, so many of my days were spent just making sure that my I's were dotted, my T's were crossed ethically. And to me, that was a commitment I made to the research. And also, for this book, every person, and I talked about those 6 individuals in this book, every person read their own chapter and gave me feedback on it. And, you know, and so to me, that was also, you know, I think it was a good move for validity, but to me that was also part of the ethics of it. So I probably, it took me an extra year. It took me longer than I thought it would to do this study. But from an IRB standpoint, I think it's really interesting. If you find yourself, for those of you who are grad students now and you go off into the wider world, if you find yourself going into a program that already has a district-wide IRB and you can put your protocol into it and research some of these interesting questions that you want to do, I definitely do it. Because trying to build it from scratch yourself is really hard if you try to do it right. I don't know if I answered your question, Drew, but
Yes, thank you.
Well, I'm wondering if you've thought about going down the route of sort of implicitly biased attitudes, implicitly racist attitudes. Well, a couple of things. One is that. So I think sometimes when you look at teachers and you have really broad sort of ideologies like colorblindness, it's harder to sort of see some of the details of their perspective. And I think most people agree with you earlier in your slide about explicit racism being reduced and whatnot, not necessarily being as much of an issue in classrooms, but implicit sort of attitudes, I think, gain a little more traction. And the other sort of element is I'm wondering how much these teachers teaching science impacts their views of race and how it affects their instruction. So as a math educator, it's another field where I don't think race impacts it.
So the first question with the implicit bias. So my experience is that, in my head, I will say to myself, that person is racist, right? I will keep that judgment, inside unless I have to hire that person or admit them into a program, then, because I've found that it's not a useful, it doesn't explain much, right? To call somebody racist, or to even just put it in terms of implicit bias or belief. My sense is that as somebody who likes looking at cognition and thinking about how people learn, any label that has a judgment attached to it isn't fruitful to me.
So you see implicit bias as having a judgment?
Well, so I'm more interested in what's the evidence that leads us to that judgment of implicit bias. What are we seeing? What are we hearing? What evidence do we have?
Sure.
Right? And so I see implicit bias as a conceptual framework, as part of somebody's conceptual ecology. It's our way of coloring the map of somebody's brain and saying, see this blue area over here? We call that implicit bias because the person's being racist and they don't even know it. Right? But so to me, the really, really, really interesting question is how do people change their minds about race, right? I think of it as a spectrum, all right? And I will say this: I was born and raised in the United States, in New Jersey. I am racist, right? There's no way for me not to be racist. So implicit bias is something, and maybe this is the critical race theorist in me talking, but race is not aberrant. Racism isn't aberrant; it's normal. Derek Bell wrote that in Faces at the Bottom of the Well. And so as a white person in society, I have that implicit bias. I think everybody has that implicit bias. Not just white people, but it's part of being human. And so to me, it's more useful to look at it as how does that show up in somebody's conceptual ecology? How does that show up on if we can map cognition, how does that show up? And I sort of saved that other part for when I have to make a decision about working with somebody or doing something with somebody. I mean, people have said some horribly racist things to me, and I make it a point afterwards to let them know that, right? That this thing that you just said, I hope you don't say that out loud again because here's why, right? And that I think that works better than Tyler's instructor who says shut it down, you're racist, because it's almost like that cauterizes somebody's conceptual ecology and fixes it in place. People plant their flag.
I haven't seen that with implicit bias. I haven't seen people sort of using it to call people racist. It's more an issue of how people have internalized sort of the broader sort of ideology of race and making a case that way. Basically, some of what you're saying, that we've all internalized racism, right? But using it as a way to sort of see how someone has internalized it, not necessarily as a sort of a label, because colorblindness is a label, right? But you were okay with that one. So
well, it's a conceptual. It's a way of describing a set of conceptions.
Sure.
And so if we're talking about implicit bias in that way, I'm okay with calling it that. But your other question about how much does science matter? Interestingly, there were some biology people who totally did not have a good understanding of the biological markers that are used in. I have a question in there about. There's a graph I pulled out of a biology textbook, a popular biology textbook, that shows a graph of skin color versus the number of genes, and it's a scientifically incorrect graph, and I verified this. But I asked people to interpret it because it shows shades from light to dark, and that the data is best shown that 4 genes control for race. It's an oversimplification that's made wrong in a textbook. We see that all the time. But my sense was even the biology folks did not have a very strong understanding of the science that underlies many of the phenotypes that are associated with race. And so I actually don't think that the science piece had much to do with it, except in the case with math, that people are much more willing to forgive science and math people and say, oh, you're not, science is hard, math is hard, it is what it is, it's this body of knowledge that people just have to learn, rather than thinking of it as an interaction between teacher and student.
Any more questions?
Finished right on time. Look at that.
Thank you.